I'm Marcos, and thank you for joining the Octavia Flynn Public Library for our Authors Festival. This year, our theme is visual storytelling, and our next guest was born at Rehoboth Mission, east of Gallup. He spent his early years at the Mariano Lake trading post. He eventually graduated from New Mexico Military Institute and went on to college at the University of Colorado. After earning his Bachelor's of Science, Master's of Science, and a PhD, he taught engineering at the University of Colorado and then at New Mexico State University. Eventually, he began working at Sandia National Laboratories, where he worked on many fascinating projects. He retired in 2000 as a distinguished member of the technical staff and did part-time consulting for another 11 years. It was after retirement when he began to explore local history. He published his first book, Kitchen's Opera House, Gallup, New Mexico, in 2002, and a second edition in 2012. In 2011, he became involved in the Albuquerque Historical Society and served as president from 2013 to 2019. Today, he's a featured speaker for the Society's Speakers Bureau and recently published a new book, A History Lover's Guide to Albuquerque. Our guest will be presenting Son of an Indian Trader, which will take a look at his life growing up in the fur trading post environment. Please feel free to leave your questions down below in the chat, and then we'll be able to do questions at the end. So now, without further ado, please allow me to introduce our historian and special guest, Roger Zimmerman.
Thank you, Marcus. Thank you for introducing me. And I might point out that maybe introducing me as a historian may be a threat to some history people. I may be an error. My civil engineering training didn't really prepare me to be a historian, but I am interested in history, and I call myself a history lover. So thanks for the introduction. Thanks for the invitation. And also thanks for Tammy Moe, director of the libraries, for inviting me to participate in this Authors Festival. Okay. What we're going to talk about today is the contents of the presentation will be an introduction. I'll kind of introduce my memoirs and some pertinent family history, and then talk about learning to trade with the Zuni Indians, and then how my folks traded with the Navajo Indians at Mariano Lake and with the Navajo and Zuni Indians in Gallup. The next three slides cover my memoirs, and I'm not going to dwell on these. There is some color coding here that is kind of important. So my memoirs, Son of the Indian Trader, will be the first two. They're highlighted in red on the slide. The memoirs are all published as ebooks under Smashwords, and you can see the address up above, and I won't dwell on that. There's another color code that's important, and this are the green numbers that are in their dates. I started writing back in 1989 as kind of a hobby, and picked up things along family or work or whatever. And also I highlighted my folks' 60th wedding anniversary in 1990. And so that's why the 1990 is there. So anyway, I won't dwell on these. You can see that the academic life, volume 2, covers my 20 years as being an instructor, a professor, and an administrator at New Mexico State University. Next slide shows some work I did at Sandia National Laboratories. And this was underground work studying the nuclear storage of nuclear waste. And the next was on some rocket work I did, where we were doing testing evaluations and flight preparations for rockets. And so this covered the two of them, 31 years. And you can see that's there. Now, there are 3 unpublished articles at the bottom. And so ordinarily you don't see fiction in memoirs, but these were areas that are sensitive, and I've written these as fiction articles, and Sandia has approved it. The next slide is my volunteer activities. I was involved in a number of things through the years, including the history that I'm talking about today. And so I won't dwell any more with that. So now let's go to the next slide, which is cover article photos. And this ties back to the Navajos. They've selected 4 mountains along geographical directions to indicate foundations for their ways of life. And these help them understand the past, present, and the future. The sacred mountains were Blanca Peak near Fort Garland, Colorado, Mount Taylor near Grants, New Mexico, San Francisco Peaks near Flagstaff, Arizona, and Mount Hesperus near Durango. I've selected 4 mountains that are important parts of my life for this. These are photographs that are shown on the upper left is Hosta Butte, which is the major feature outside of Mariano Lake. The next one, where I spent 10 years getting through school, was at the University of Colorado, and that's the Flatirons. The next one, upper right, are the Oregon Mountains, where I spent 15 years at New Mexico State University. And the bottom one is the South Sandia Peak, where I spent 42 years in my activities with Sandia. And so I have these photographs in my living room, and they're just important to me, and I wanted to share them with the books, either the ebooks or the printed books. Next is the family history in Indian trading, and this is just a one-page thing that kind of summarizes my parents coming to New Mexico, my dad in 1929, my mom in 1930, and what happened to them after that. But that first year they were at McGaffey's store. We'll talk about it. And then in red, we'll talk about it in more detail. Will be the things that I'll focus on with some stories. So next will be learning to be a trader to the Zunis. And there's a lot to this slide. My parents grew up on farms in southern Michigan. They went to the same high school in Waldron. And my dad was getting out of business school in Indiana, and he was looking for a job. The family farm was going to an older brother who was the farmer, and so Dad studied business. And he had another brother, Orville, who had come out west in 1906 because of health reasons. And so he had been here for a long time. He was at this time, he was a bookkeeper for a sawmill and the McGaffey sawmill store. And so he hired his brother as the bookkeeper. So Dad came out in August of 1929 and went to work. One of the first things he bought was an engagement ring to send back to my mother, who was in Michigan. And so he brought her out, and they got married on January 7th, 1930. And that was what we celebrated 60 years later in that first story that is in the book. Well, some bad things happened in McGaffey at that point in time. The owner of the sawmill was killed in an airplane accident, and the Depression had hit. And so they closed the sawmill. So here were my parents out here without a job, and they were looking for something to do. Mom wanted to go back to Michigan, and Dad was hoping to do something here. And they went to Zuni and talked to Mr. Kelsey, and he didn't have a job opening, but he found one. And pretty soon he showed up, and they got to go to work in Zuni. So they moved to Zuni in 1930 and learned the language and culture. So imagine going from farms in Michigan to Zuni Pueblo in New Mexico and trading with them. During those 5-6 years that Dad was there, he learned to be an Indian trader. He learned what needed to be done. And so he was doing well. The folks enjoyed the community of Zuni with both, although they had to realize that the majority of the people around them spoke a different language and had a different culture. But there were some other traders and teachers that they got acquainted with. And so socially, they weren't isolated. Dad got to liking Indian trading, and so he decided he wanted to get a store on his own. And so that became his wish. Well, it turned out that the older brother, Orville, who hired him in McGaffey, was working for the Gallup Mercantile, and he knew of a store in Mariano Lake that was for sale. It was 30 miles north and east of Gallup. And so he arranged for Dad to look it over, and Dad and the Gallup Mercantile worked out a deal where Dad could buy the store, so Dad could own a trading post. Mom didn't want to put too much money into it, so they put $200 into it and borrowed $3,800 to buy the trading post. And that was what got that started. Dad had to learn the culture and the language. Navajo was completely different from Zuni, and they were isolated. They were in a remote site where the nearest non-Indian neighbors were 9 miles away. And I might point out that Orville has a granddaughter in Gallup, Christine Hanley. And so there are still roots that tie back to Orville. The slide shows what Mariano Lake was, what they paid $4,000 for. You can see that things were fairly primitive in 1936. There was another factor that was involved in this. Mom was pregnant during this move. Can you imagine growing up in a farm in Michigan, coming out west, living in the Zuni Pueblo and learning that culture, and then all of a sudden moving to Mariano Lake? You got to give Mom and Dad a lot of credit. Mariano Lake Trading Post was started in 1890 by Charlie Whittemire, who was the person who started the Gallup Merc, which became Charles Elfield. And you can see the names of the owners. Dad owned it for 8 years, from 1936 to 1944. It was closed in 93 and demolished in around 2010. One of the features of this, we had to haul water 17 miles from Crown Point, potable water. And Mom stored it in milk cans. In schooling, there were no schools there. I had to board out the first semester of my first year, and Mom didn't like that, and I wasn't real happy with it. And so Mom and I moved into Gallup for the second semester in 1943. Next are trading post functions. The center of social activity was at the trading post. Communications, economics, everything ran through the trading post at Mariano Lake. And the services provided by the traders were postmaster, translator. You can see the list. I want to draw attention to the translator because Dad said he was having to learn the language. Remember that was also part of what he had to do. And I'll explain how that came about. But one of the things that stories he told me about the translator was during World War II that there was a young Navajo that was killed in the war. And the word came through, and Dad had to explain to the family that they lost a son in a war that they probably didn't know a lot about. And that was one of the tough things that he had to do. Also a mortician. The Navajos have some things that are different from the Anglo community on the burial of people who've passed away. And so sometimes the trader got involved in that. Transportation, pawnbroker, and also. The pictures of me about 4 years old, and behind me is my dad with a little mustache. And he wore that mustache during most of the 30s. It looked like Hitler. And so when World War II came, they changed, and he cut off the mustache. Trading post facility. What he owned were buildings, inventory, and the contents. The land was owned by the tribe, and the trading post itself was a 10 by 15 trading area with no chairs. Notice the people sitting out in front on that first picture of Mariano Lake. Well, that's where people sat. Now, Dad had a potbelly stove in the store, And so people would gather around, but they would be standing and talking. But he wanted the store to be for trading and not for visiting. So that was one of the reasons. The gas pump, large safe, warehouse, and barn. And you can see me out with one of my toys. The folks tried to keep me occupied because I was by myself a lot of the time. So I had lots of good toys. The trading post facility, again, home connected to the trading post. This is a big snow that occurred, and the home is the building in back. And it has, you can see the things that were there. We had an electric generator for electricity, and we used a cistern for occasional water that didn't need to be potable. Now, the trading with the Navajos is the next kind of area I wanted to go into. Is the government provided the sheep to the Navajos after the Long Walk in 1868. But this established a biannual debt reduction system that the traders had to work with. And this was true in Zuni as well. In the spring, in June, they would shear the sheep and goats and sell the wool. And then in October, they would go do the same. They would sell the sheep and goats to the traders, and they would settle debts. So the trader would have to handle credit for all of the expenditures of the families for 6 months. Twice a year, they had big income, and twice a year they had to carry a lot of things on credit. And so that was an important part of trading in those days. The trader also bartered. If the Navajos did some jewelry or rugs or things like that, the trader would work with the families and agree on the service, the prices, and things like that. And that would help reduce the biannual debt. And then another thing that I read that I thought was important is that we should remember that there's a record that says that only 2/3 of the Navajos could speak English in the 50s, in the early 50s. And so everything had to be in Navajo. Now, during World War II, a major change happened, is that the government decided that they wanted to build igloos outside of Gallup, out by Fort Wingate. And they decided they needed to recruit Navajos to build this ordinance. And so they went to the two traders that were further away from Gallup. Springstead's was fairly close, but Pinedale was further out, and we were 30 miles out at Mariano Lake. So they came in one day and says, by tonight, we want you to deliver as many people as you can to Fort Wingate so we can get to work on building these igloos. And so Dad and Dan Christensen at Pinedale got 21 workers there that night. And the government took over and took the workers, and then the Dad and Dan went in on Friday and brought them back to their homes. But that started something that was very important. And so the construction of the ordinance became a major event for the trading post. And every Sunday evening, they would haul a truckload of people to Fort Wingate, and then Friday night, they'd bring them back. But during the week, the people could spend money, and Dad would then cash the check, and they would settle the debts that occurred during the week. Now, if the family had things that were beyond what the check was, then this would go on the biannual debt, which would be settled in either June or October. But Wingate Ordnance Depot stimulated the local economy. All of a sudden, there was cash in the vicinity of Mariano Lake. Now, trading post operations. Dad went out there on his own with Mom and didn't know the culture, didn't know the language. And he was fortunate to run into a person who had worked around the store and who spoke English and knew the Navajos. His name was Clarence Warner. And you can see that how they split things out. Dad was responsible for the financial operations and the trading practices, and Dad had the responsibility to get the right stuff. He had to buy the right things, and with a goal of selling them for a profit. He needed to pay off his debts and to have some income. So that was his part. Clarence was an employee that interfaced with his neighbors. He did not have a formal education. He had to respect the need for the trader to make a profit. He had to ensure that trading was done honestly. He had to believe that good trading was good for his neighbors. And the previous trader had been bad, and Clarence knew the problems. And so he certainly helped Dad with that and also taught Dad how to speak Navajo. And I might add that Clarence later became head of the Mariano Lake chapter for the Navajo tribe. Now, talk a little bit about some Playmates. This picture on the upper left has been around quite a bit. It was in some newspaper articles about one of the books I wrote, and it's a real special picture to me because the young lady in the center there, Violet Warner, is the daughter of Clarence Warner, and you see her and you see me, and the boy that's bigger than both of us is Jimmy, and he was a nephew of the Warners of Clarence and a cousin of Violet, but was living with them. As the Navajos often did, is that the families would get together and help each other out, and Jimmy was one of those. Well, that's the picture that's been around. It's in the memoirs. But the next is a picture of Violet and I that was taken in 2013. And I'm happy to report that Violet is doing quite well. I've talked to her this week. I've talked to her sons, and she's still living in the family compound near Mariano Lake, and has escaped COVID. And she and her younger brother are doing some sheep herding as a hobby, not as something that they need. Other playmates came from Pinedale, which is 9 miles away, and two of them, Dorothy and Alan. Jay was a little younger and came over, and you could see we were playing with scooters and things like that. But when I was playing with Violet and Jimmy, I was working more with animals and things like that because that's what they were used to. And then I did have a dog. The in kind of closing up this section on the trading post is I had to deal with isolation. I had, as an only child, I had to learn to entertain myself. I had to learn to communicate with people who had a different language and culture. I had to learn to share my toys with others. Think about that. That's something that kids don't give up very easily. But if I was happy to see Violet or Alan and Dorothy or Jay or something, and I had to learn to share the enjoyment of having playmates. And then I've already talked a little bit about this last point, so let's go on to the. So now, 1944, the war was uh, in full swing, and Dad only had one child, and so he was vulnerable to the draft. And so he was drafted, and this was in 44. He sold the store, the trading post, went into Gallup, worked, and then had to go in 45. And so Mom and I spent 1945 in Waldron, Michigan, and while Dad was in the service. And when he got out in 46, then he wanted to come back to New Mexico, and he liked owning a trading post. So he was looking at one near Pine Springs, Arizona, near Sanders, and he looked at that. Mom kept saying, "Hey, schooling is tough. Let's be in town." So he looked at a Kaiser Fraser auto dealership in Berlin. He would have bought the building, and then he would have been effectively the franchisee to sell Kaiser Fraser. And of course, how many of you remember what a Kaiser Fraser is? So most young folks don't. And they didn't succeed. So there's a story about he almost bought it and he fainted while he was signing the papers. And Mom was very superstitious, and she says that's a bad omen. and so they dropped out of that. So then the Popular Dry Goods store in Gallup became available, and that's what they bought. And so I talked about the schooling, but there's a point in the bottom of the slide that I think is important, is that Dad recognized that the Navajos were changing. They were mobile, that riding in the back of pickups to go work was one thing. And so they were in pickups, and they were coming to town in large groups. And so one, goods were cheaper. Two, there was a greater variety. Think about it, boots. A trader couldn't keep as many boots as the Navajos would like. And Mexico started producing real colorful boots. And boy, they sold like wildfire. And so you could get those in Gallup. You couldn't get them in a trading post. Rugs and jewelry would bring better prices in Gallup. And the dealing in Gallup was cash rather than the biannual debt reduction where you had difficulty sometimes getting debts collected. Next is, so he bought the Popular Dry Goods store in April of 1946. So if you think about that, that was 75 years ago. The store was on Front Street where the Indians traded. And one of the criteria that to work at the store is you had to speak Navajo. You had to speak store Navajo. You didn't have to carry on general conversations, but you had to work in the store. And so, and Dad spoke both Navajo and Zuni. And so he covered the Zunis as they came in. He changed the name to Zimmerman's in 1947, and it still exists. And his way of running the store is that one or two people worked the cash register. So there was good control of the money always. That's the way he did it. Now, this is a picture that I found in 1929 that shows the Popular Dry Goods and the Opera House Bar and the Eagle Cafe. So the book I wrote about the Kitchens Opera House talked about the Opera House Bar and the Eagle Cafe. It goes way back to 1895. But what I'm talking about today is just that little store to the left there. And that's what it looked like in those days. If you really look carefully, you can see Popular Dry Goods above the door. This is what the store looked like inside. You can see my dad on the left, and you can see there's a clerk on the right just over the hat. She's got dark hair. That's Eleanor Ariano. And she was Hispanic. And in those days, in 1946, most of the clerks were Hispanic. The Navajos weren't in town that much and weren't looking for jobs. And so the Hispanics learned Navajo, and she did. She was a longtime worker in the 40s. And another point, you'll see that there's shawls, and you see hats, and you can see underwear and shirts and pants and everything. Essentially the store provided for the needs of the Navajos for living on the reservation. It wasn't for Saturday night socials. And so that was part. I used to say, Dad, you sure have a lot of stuff in the store. And he says, you can't sell it if you don't have it. Anyway, next picture are some of the clerks of the store. And it's kind of fun to reminisce a little bit. The picture on the upper left shows a number of people with Dad in the background with the bald head by this time. And I know this was after 1950 because of a story I'll tell. But anyway, the person on the left is the person below, and I think that's her school picture. That's Eleanor Davis, and that's another picture for her in a leather outfit. And she worked there a number of years. They were close family friends, and she became a nurse, married a person in the service, and had a good life. And we kept up with them with Christmas cards for years. The upper right is Eloise Watchman, and she's the person on the right in the figure. And she was a real good student in Gallup High, and later went out to the tribe and had an important position in the tribe. The person to her left and to the right of Mrs. Nelson is Milla McKinley. She was Hispanic, and she was involved in as a clerk, and she spoke Navajo, store Navajo, as we all did. And then the person to the right of Mrs. Kita Mrs. Nelson, is Elizabeth Keita. And her sister, Clara West, worked in the store for over 40 years. We'll see a picture of her shortly. So, and I don't know the other girl in the front there. But anyway, this is a special picture of what the Glerks were in the early 50s. Now, somewhere in the 50s, Dad expanded the store. He bought the jewelry store. Bill Richardson had that, and he opened that, and he bought that up. So he expanded. So you can see that there's a man and a woman, two clerks, and my dad standing there. But you see an opening. So Dad expanded the store at that point in time. And I'll tell a story about Arnold. But notice that Clara was from the store. She came in around 1952, and she worked there through the early 90s. She lived in St. Michael's, Arizona the whole time and commuted 28 miles each way for those 40 years. And Lucille Anderson was actually from Laguna, Pueblo, and she's there in the picture. And the store, go to the next page then, why Arnold got hired. Mrs. Nelson was the cashier, and the story that I tell about her, she was hired, I know when it was in August of 1940, 1950, I'll get it right, 1950, because it was August. Dad came down with the mumps, a serious case of the mumps, and he couldn't work the store. Mom took over and was the cashier and took care of things. Well, she fell down the back steps and sprained her ankle, and she was laid up. So for 2 days in 1950, I opened the store. I unlocked the safe. I put the money in the safe. And so I ran the store for 2 days. And Dad hired Mrs. Nelson on the phone, and she showed up on Wednesday of that week. So that's my management experience. Now, there's a story about why Arnold got hired. And a Navajo came in, and I think he'd had a little bit too much alcohol. And he looked at a hat, decided he liked the hat. And so he started walking out wearing the hat. And the clerk hollered to my dad and said, "Zim," that's what everybody called him, "Zim, that guy's stealing that hat." So Dad ran up to the guy and challenged him, and the guy looked at him and kind of weaved a little bit. And he swung at my dad. And my dad had taken a little boxing in college, and he decked him. And Dad, I remember him coming home and saying, "Well, I think I need another man in the store." And so he hired Arnold in 1953. And Arnold stayed with him until he bought Dad out by 1990. And then Arnold sold the store to your mayor, Louis Bonaguidi, and his son in around 2008. And so that's kind of the history of the store. And Dad expanded the store twice, and I've talked about that, so we won't. Now, what about me? I was a watcher in my early years. I was a clerk by 1950. I was about 14. And this is kind of a story that's kind of interesting. I had to figure tax in my head. The Navajos felt that they didn't have to pay taxes. And there are exemptions and like that. But sales tax, they weren't happy to pay in those days. And so Dad said, if you tell somebody what a price is, like a pair of shoes, baby shoes, might be $1.98. It says, all right, if you tell them $1.98, and then you go to the cashier and they charge you $2.02, the people aren't very happy. You tell them in Navajo, and they aren't happy. I don't pay tax. And so Dad says what you do is when you see that's $1.98, you calculate 2% sales tax, add it to the price. And so when the person goes up to check out, when the clerk writes the ticket, the tax is right. And when the change is brought back, it's exact. And so that's one of the things we had to do. So again, we had to get by and figure that. Now, the story, I think I've got time to tell about trading with the Navajos. And Dad says no high pressure and maybe suggest another item. And so this story is a little suspect, but it brings out the point that those of us that were non-Navajos had a little bit of a handicap. We sometimes would get screwed up in our language. And so the one story that was passed around the store, and I don't know whether it's true or not entirely, but I do know the story was passed around. And this was when some Navajos were looking at a table, and the Hispanic clerk was working, and she thought, well, maybe she could sell him a brush. And so the word for saying for that is Bejo, no, Bejo Dotsi, and that's brush maybe. Well, she said Bejo Dotsi, and at that time, Bejos meant referring to your anatomy at what that you're sitting on. And so, can you imagine that we all kind of laughed? And after it was over, we said, "You know what you said to those folks?" And so it was a big deal. But those are the realities of working in cross cultures, cross languages. And I should also point out, my memoirs don't mention my Zuni name, but I do have a Zuni name as well. I was 12 or 13, and I was developing some peach fuzz and kind of growing up. And Frank Bossett, who was an excellent jewelry maker, was in the store talking to my dad, probably in Zuni. And he noticed me, and he's got some peach fuzz on him. I'll name him Peaches. And so my Zuni name is Mochiqua, which means peaches. Now, Clara West, who worked there all these years, gave me a nice Navajo name, Navajo Blue Eyes. And so Denis Benado Klish. And so that's my name that I use, and I'm very proud of. Here's a picture of the store around 2002. And just to show the expansion, if you go under the Z, that's Bill Richardson's store. If you go under the MMER, that's the original Poplar Dry Goods. And then as the clientele changed, and as Dad bought the Opera House in 1968, and there's a story, I need to come back and tell the story about that. But he made a saddle shop out of that. And he was opening up to a Western wear store. And so that became the saddle shop. And then next to that is still the Eagle Cafe that's been there all these years. The thing was, in the store that he bought on the Poplar Dry Goods, he never did own the property. He owned the business, and he leased the one story. So Bill Richardson's old place and the Poplar Dry Goods were all leased all of the years that he did that. Well, he got to thinking that the owner, Park Sellard, was getting old, and the family might not be a good renter, and so he better have some insurance. So the Opera House became available, and so Dad thought if he lost his lease, he could move into the Opera House, and so that's what he bought it in 1968. Okay, I'm kind of finishing up. I've got just about 3 more slides. I learned some things I learned as a kid. I learned how trust was essential to our survival. Think about this. My dad had to be trusted by the Navajos, our Zunis. Fairness had to be accepted by the people who did not have the same education, language, or customs. And bookkeeping had to be accepted as accurate. And the people, the clients, had to be comfortable working with him. And so Dad had to develop that amount of trust. I learned how 2 people with vastly different backgrounds, racial birthrights, and different cultures could work together for a common cause. And that's Dad and Clarence Warner. Dad could not have survived at Mariano Lake without Clarence Warner, period. I learned how clerks needed to be able to communicate effectively with persons who spoke different languages. And then Dad always had this philosophy. It sounds kind of corny, but he said, the store owner and employees should be better off with the sale, and the Indians should be better off after a sale because they have new clothes, new boots, new hats, new things that they could use in their life. And so he always had that philosophy. The way he treated Clara West was there 40 years. Well, Dad had a philosophy of giving bonuses each year. And so that was the way that she picked up some extra money and seems to be happy if she was there 40 years. And so finally, I want to read this last statement. It's an important statement because I was blessed with having parents who had an undeniable appetite to take on challenges, having risks and hardships. And they displayed a demonstrated ability to be successful in meeting them. So that's kind of the background. Now the next slide is what I call the rest of the story. You notice with my memoirs, I didn't become an Indian trader. My grandpa both grandpas, in fact, were farmers. My dad became an Indian trader, and I got hooked on engineering in junior high school. And so Howard Ellsworth was the science teacher. When I moved to Albuquerque later on, he was an insurance agent in Albuquerque, so I got reunited with him. But anyway, he got me interested in mechanical engineering. I later changed to civil. But anyway, I wanted to do something else, and I wanted to do my own thing. And so after high school, I graduated. Dad let me kind of not work in the store anymore. I'd worked every year up until 1954. And you could see that the high class stuff that I was doing. I unloaded freight cars at 75 cents an hour, and that was work. And then that wasn't even full time, that was part time. And so then I got full time work at Hudgens Phillips 66 station out between the El Rancho and Earl's restaurant. Was where I was working. And I got a raise, 92 cents an hour for full time work. And it happened to be that Arnold Hudgens' dad owned that store. Arnold Hudgens' brother was the mechanic. And so I was working, so we had two families with trading sons and dads. I enrolled in engineering at the University of Colorado in the fall of 54 and studied and worked and had a fun 57-year career. And that's what the rest of the memoirs talk about. Now, think about Arnold. Here he was with me as a threat. Should he put all of his eggs in the basket of staying and working with Dad, or should he do something else? And so he stuck around through 1961, and Dad kept hoping I would come back and take over the store. And by 1961, he finally decided that engineering was for me, the store wasn't for me, and Arnold signed a breath of relief because then it was going to become his, which it was. So I'm extremely thankful for this valuable and unique experience that I had being the son of the Indian trader. And, the neat experiences, I had one yesterday. My Navajo class playmate, Violet, I showed you her pictures early, had a picture that she sent to her sons that he sent to me and said that I could share with you. So if you'll show the next thing. This is one of the treasures of working as the son of an Indian trader. There I am, about 4 or 5, and Violet is in her mother's arms, and that's her mother, Florence, and that's Violet's grandfather, who probably was born soon after the long walk. And so here I am as the son of an Indian trader being in a family photo. I just think it's just absolutely precious. So anyway, that's the end of my presentation, and I'll be glad to try to answer questions.
All right, thank you very much for sharing those with us. We do have some questions in our Facebook feed, and we also have some questions that were asked previous. So I'm just going to kind of skip around and ask a few questions here and there. Okay. Go ahead and put him up. Okay. So one of the questions that somebody asked in our Facebook chat was, What was your favorite game as a child?
Roller skating.
Was it easy to roller skate? Like, did you have smooth areas to roller skate
Yeah, I've had some pretty good hills.
on?
You learn to survive.
Along this line of questioning, what was your favorite snack as a kid, and what do you wish was still around right
Well, uh, snacks, probably anything sweet. Uh, I remember it was probably around 1952 or 53 that we got a Dairy Queen. And I'm telling you, that was really an improvement when we could finally get ice cream that way at the Dairy Queen. So I think that was kind of a highlight of, of food and things like that. And what was the other part of the question?
now? What do you wish was still around right now that might not be anymore?
Let me come back to that one. Still around in Gallup or around whatever?
Like things that you enjoyed, maybe snack wise or
Oh,
food wise.
food wise. It's still not available. I don't know though. I'll try.
That's okay. So we have another question from our Facebook chat. A gentleman named Jim says, "What would you say is the most valuable lesson you learned growing up at the trading post?"
I think trust in people. I think absolutely that's the most important. That I learned how my folks could earn the trust of people who completely had different cultures and languages and whatever. And I saw that was important. And I would say that clearly it's trust.
That makes sense. Going to our pre-questions. Let's see. I don't see any at the moment. It looks to be the.
I'll tell you something while you're looking that up. I'll tell you a food thing that they don't have now. That they have it, but it's not in the context. In the old days, the Elks, the Elks Club, I think, was on Strong and Coal, and some folks had a restaurant in it that served non-elk people, and I remember that I could get 6 shrimp on Friday nights at the Elks Club, and that was a real treat. And I don't think I can do that anymore at an Elks Club. So you said sweet, but anyway,
Oh, that's okay.
that was something that was really a really big deal.
So, the question that I have is, I know you have other presentations, and one of those is on Kitchen's Opera House. Can you share a little bit of, just something short that you remember about Kitchen's Opera House when your family first acquired it?
Well, yeah, opera was never sung there. Now, you probably want a little more than that.
I often wondered about that, though. That's good.
No, there were. It was built in 1895, and it was built in 6 months. Think about that. They started in January. It was snowy and the weather was bad, but they got it pretty well built. A two-story building, brick building, Winslow brick, and got it built in 1895. And they had the grand opening in July. The Wingate Ordnance Band came in and they had a dance, and so it went up that fast, and it's still standing. That's the remarkable thing I think about it. But anyway, that got started. So the one thing that I found in research of the Opera House that was a constant was dancing. I don't care what they did in the Opera House. I don't care whether it was a boxing match or an opera presentation, or not opera, but I mean a musical or entertainment presentation. There was an opera. But, why was it called an opera house? I think because it had an elevated stage. It had mobile chairs. I didn't have fixed chairs. It didn't have boxes, but they wanted to call it an opera house because they wanted to sound sophisticated. And so that was part of that. But so you had all kinds of productions. You had high school graduations. You had church services. You had everything in the upper part of the opera house. The lower part was always a bar, and the cafe started. They called it. This is not. They called it the Japanese cafe. And it started that way, and then George Tyra took it over in about 1928 or 29, made it the Eagle Cafe, and it's still the Eagle Cafe. And I think that's a remarkable that you've got that restaurant that's been in existence since 1895, and it's still there and it's still functioning. The bar in the 1960s, Gallup had a problem with drinking. So the businessmen were trying to reduce the number of bars. So guess what? Dad bought a bar, but he put it into a saddle shop. And there were others that did that. And so the number of bars in Gallup was reduced because of that activity. And so that was another thing. But I guess the Opera House gained its real fame during the miners' strike in 1933, and all of the things that happened there, and that was I tried to document that, and that was an important part. It's interesting that two things happened near when the strike and the martial law were over. Was one, the martial law was over, and two, prohibition was over. So guess what happened? There were events. So anyway, those are some things that come to mind.
Was it a hard transition coming from Mariano Lake into town and having to readjust to things?
For me or for my folks?
Both.
Well, it was hard because the reason we did that is Dad knew he was needing to go in the Army. And so he had been owner of a store and it had worked out well. And so he had to go back to work for somebody and until he went in the service. So that was a hard transition for him. It wasn't, well, it was kind of hard. We talk about sports. It was kind of a transition for me when we went to Michigan, 1945, 1946. I took the fourth grade in Michigan. Growing up on a trading post, we didn't play baseball. We didn't play softball. I really knew nothing about that particular activity. I got to Michigan and everybody played softball and baseball. So I was I was still an isolated person. And so I didn't really get some real good friendships because I wasn't part of that type of activity. And so anyway, that was a thought that comes to mind. But it was just that we had to change our life because of the war situation. And then the big choice was, do we go to Michigan or stay in Michigan or come back? And I know what Dad wanted to do. He wanted to own a trading boat store or something. And that's what he did. He did it, I figured 52 years that he owned a business.
We have another question that came through our Facebook from Joe Sabatini. And he says, do you have a favorite memory of Route 66?
Yeah, but it's a long story. But I'll tell you, I'll tell it anyway, because I could get a driver's license at the age of 14. And so I was driving around. Well, one of the times I was 14, maybe 15. I think I was 14. I drove out to Springstead's trading post. my mom made me promise that I would not drive on Route 66. So she made me promise that. All right. So I picked up a couple of friends. We went north to Gaberkel. We found an old dirt road to get out back of the pyramid and got to Springstead's trading post. And so we saw Bronson, Springstead, and that family, and it was time to come home. So we came back, and we were coming back, and I remembered a road along in front of the Red Rocks, a dirt road that I could take, and I could get back to Gallup without being on Route 66 because that was an absolute no-no. So I was driving along this dirt road. I got stuck in sand, and pretty soon I had the gas tank sitting on the sand, and we were horribly stuck. And so we had to walk across the railroad tracks, the Perco, and into a family that happened to be that their daughter was in our class, and so there were no problems there. But anyway, they came over and pulled me out, and I did drive on Route 66 to get home. So
that's great. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Okay. If there are any final questions, anyone who's in the Zoom chat, feel free to leave a question in the chat, or we can unmute you for a moment if you'd like to ask a live question. But we'll take any final questions. And while we wait to see if anyone has any final questions, again, we want to thank you very much for joining us and for listening to Mr. Zimmerman share all this great knowledge with us.
Marcos, this is Louis Bonavidi. If I may say, I appreciate Roger taking the time to come to Gallup. I've known Roger for many years, and specifically about the Opera House. He wrote a book about it. I mean, if anybody's interested, I think it's still available, isn't it, Roger?
Your book's still available?
No, yeah, on Amazon as an ebook.
Anyway, it's really an interesting book. I'll tell you a little bit of story about Roger and us. My wife had a Relay for Life team, and she come up with an idea about how we could make money for cancer. And what we did is we got permission from the city. We end up with 2 firefighters and 2 policemen, and we sold tickets for an inspection. I mean, people were interested in the Opera House, and basically we sold the tickets for $30 each. It was BYOF, bring your own flashlight, because there's nothing up there, there's no electricity or anything. And we did it on a Sunday, and we had close to 50 people that basically paid $30 each to see the Opera House. And it started at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and it lasted until 4:30 when it started, just before getting dark. But not one person left. And of course, Roger was there. We talked him into coming down, and he had just written the book about the Opera House. And it was very well received. Like I said, not one person left. They stayed through the whole thing and ended up buying books from Roger for that event. He says he's not much of a historian, but I think he's a terrific historian for Gallup. It's amazing what he remembers. And of course, there's not very many of us that have the ability to write. And Roger did a beautiful job on the Opera House. And I appreciate listening to him this afternoon. I think we've got a valuable asset in Roger and his remembrance of our community, because, like I said, there's just not very many people that have recorded the history of Gallup. Roger, I enjoyed the afternoon, and thanks for coming down.
Thank you, Louis.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. All right. Any final thoughts? No? Okay. Any final words before we say our goodbyes?
No, thank you for inviting me to come over and relive some pleasant memories of growing up in Gallup. And so I hope that I communicated things well and accurately.
You did. Thank you. It was very informative for me too. I really enjoyed listening to your stories and just seeing what things were like, when I wasn't around. Just in case anyone is interested, Roger's book is available here at the library. It's called Kitchen's Opera House, Gallup, New Mexico. It's the same one that Mr. Mayor Boniguidi was talking about. So please feel free to check that out from us and learn more. Um, Again, thank you to our special guest, Roger Zimmerman, for sharing about his life and growing up at a trading post and all the work that they did here in town as well. The Octavia Flynn Library in Gallup invites you to continue to join us for our live and recorded programming during the rest of this month. You can find the schedule of our events on our website at ofpl.online. Please make sure you follow us on Facebook. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please give us some likes and some comments. Let us know how we're doing. We definitely love to hear from you. And if you have ideas for future programming, we'd love to hear that as well. Make sure you stay up to date on everything that we have going on. And again, thank you very much. On behalf of the Octavia Flynn Public Library, we thank you for watching and hope